Today's seminar is going to go as follows. We're going to go through an introduction, briefly refer to my group's research interests, as well as some motivation for today's presentation, and then delve into the two main foci of our work: evacuation route planning for alternative fuel vehicles and supplementary infrastructure deployment, so that we can assist securing evacuations infrastructure. I conclude with some ongoing and future research in this space. Our group develops quantitative models, algorithms, data-driven solutions to emerging mobility challenges, particularly aiming towards the decarbonization of the transportation system. And we have two thrusts that we currently conduct research on: electric vehicles infrastructure planning and management, and data analytics for sustainable transportation. For the former, we have work that we categorize in the area of route design for evacuations that can assist the heterogeneity of gasoline, electric, battery electric, and fuel cell electric vehicles that we have currently operating in our communities. But also we do research on policy making and design of incentives, such as rebates and charging infrastructure investments, so that we can help public agencies meet their environmental externality reduction goals. In the data analytics side, we have put together metrics such as transportation energy vulnerability metrics across the United States, so that we can measure the burdens that using transportation bring to households and the potential opportunities for electrification to alleviate some of those. And we assess policies so that we can see how equitable or inequitable can be, with mechanisms that can help them alleviate disproportionate impacts on disadvantaged and lower income communities. We work towards addressing the grand challenge of decarbonizing transportation systems. We know that the transportation sector is the biggest carbon dioxide consumer. Globally, 37% of the carbon dioxide is produced by transportation as an end sector. And there are a few solutions to address climate change. We can potentially shift towards cleaner technologies. This is part of the solution space, of course. We also need managed transportation system, travel demand management, electricity decarbonization efforts with the introduction of renewables, and of course, behavioral attitudinal changes. We also see that a lot of our policy making in the past resulted in having disadvantaged communities becoming less able to access infrastructure or not having the same accessibility to resources. And this is something that we strive to address in our studies with models that specifically tackle the socioeconomic and demographic groups that were in such a way disadvantaged. Last but not least, climate change brings the need for emergency response and resilience of our infrastructure systems. And us as engineers and the next generation of engineers that we educate need to be able to deploy models that do not only account for economic benefits, but also sustainability and resilience ones. I'm going to start with the first area of focus, our work on evacuation route planning for alternative fuel vehicles. This is work that was published in Transportation Research Part C, and I would have to shout out to my PhD candidate, Denise Apurba, in our group, as well as our collaborator, Dr. Boyadzis, from the Industrial and Enterprise Systems Engineering. So in 2023, I talked to a journalist from NPR for Northern Colorado, and they asked me, why do we need charging infrastructure in areas along corridors that they have not materialized electric vehicle adoption yet? And this is because charging infrastructure is not only deployed in major centers, but also along these corridors to facilitate and route charging of long distance travelers. At the very same time, this deployment helps towards building trust to this network and can help for non-habitual trips to accommodate and facilitate recharging sessions in cases like evacuations. And I was able to discuss more about that and our research that was published a few years ago with journalists from Houston and Florida discussing more about the need for local agency modelers to acknowledge and account for alternative fuel vehicle travelers and their technological shortcomings that these have in their planning, so that we can make sure that battery electric vehicle travelers, fuel cell electric vehicle travelers can accommodate their evacuations without being left out or stranded. Okay, so the motivation for this study is that these events, extreme events, hurricanes, floodings, happening more and more often. And in the state of Florida during Hurricane Ian in 2022, there were more than 14 counties and parishes that mandated evacuation with orders that they announced. You can see also that agencies like Harris County need to put forward maps with detailed information to their constituents on which routes they need to choose in order to pursue evacuation, so that this information is readily available to them, with information like highlighting major evacuation routes, denoting areas that potential contraflow is needed, and the notion of contraflow is pretty much tied to the fact that links on the transportation network can change direction, because usually during evacuation, we'll move away from the hazard, right? Not towards the hazard. So in order to evacuate, we can change the direction with the contraflow premise. We can double or increase the capacity of our own links and improve the network's performance. So all this information is available to the constituents in advance. We also identify the need to address outdated evacuation plans. And Department of Homeland Security, Federal Highway Administration, FEMA, all of them have plans for assisting agencies to devise routes for evacuations. And they instruct them to consider routing people through respite sites that usually give them access to gasoline stations. However, there's no detailed recommendations for alternative fuel vehicles process. And we know that looking into evacuation literature and synthesizing outputs there, that there is no essentially constraint associated with the fuel limitations or charging limitations, battery state of charge limitations that these new vehicle technologies might have. And there's no accommodation of the travelers in order to reroute to access refueling or charging infrastructure on their way to their safe destination or shelter. So these assumptions might be okay for the mainstream vehicle technologies, gasoline technologies in particular, and diesel ones, because we have a very well-developed and dense refueling infrastructure network. Gas stations are very ubiquitous, but they're not necessarily addressing the contemporary emerging technologies. So in our model, we aim to address this gap. There is also the need to acknowledge the characteristics of the vehicles that make them primed to be more vulnerable during these setups. And this is not to say that electric vehicles are not the future or they're not a prominent technologies just because they have these shortcomings, because we, as we established earlier, we need to consider diversity of our fuel and power sources of our transportation sector to address the carbon output of our transportation domain. But it's important to acknowledge that this technology needs to be integrated in our existing models so that we are more prepared and have plans already to address their needs. And you can see from the Department of Energy that battery electric vehicles have a median range of 234 compared to a 400 range of gasoline conventional vehicle, and that we already have sparse charging infrastructure networks, as well as time-consuming recharging processes. And that is expected because we can recharge our vehicles at home as well. But this does not aid us necessarily during evacuation setups, particularly in preemptive evacuations. We have the ability to plan and start with the fully battery state of charge from home. But as you can see in the picture on your right, there is evacuation displacement that often exceeds the median driving range of a battery electric vehicle. And thus, we need to plan accordingly to provide access to charging infrastructure on the way to shelters for those that are traveling these distances. So in our process, how would we go about designating evacuation routes? And I provide an example from Washington, D.C. We travel every year to the Transportation Research Board annual meeting, and you can notice along some routes, the evacuation route designation, right? So they have been proactive in order to define these important routes as the ones that people can use to evacuate. And I imagine the fact that several federal agencies are and the President of the United States and other representatives are staying there. This has to do more about that as well. But other areas that are frequently impacted by hurricane events, such as the St. John County in Florida, has already defined maps with detailed directions on how those that live in hazard-prone areas can quickly evacuate and head to safety. What is missing from these plans is the fact that we currently have diversity of fuels, right? So in our route designation model, we will aim to have those diverse vehicle fuel types considered and design routes that are tailored to rerouting these evacuees to access refueling or charging infrastructure in the process. We still need to keep characteristics that make evacuation performance be at its best. These characteristics are coming from empirical studies that experts have run in actual evacuation cases. So we see that from Hurricane Katrina in the aftermath in New Orleans, there was a lot of confusion regarding which routes people need to use, and at major intersections, there was congestion and bottlenecks created because they were unsure which route they need to follow. And seamlessness has been identified as a route characteristic that can help people in advance have a very clear idea on one route that can get them to safety. So this is enforced with what we call evacuation tree, expanding tree constraints. This is also very helpful because it can streamline coordination and enforcement efforts from the police or other coordinators who are on site. Contraflow is the concept that I also introduced in the beginning, making sure that certain links on the network are fully utilized by increasing their capacity, improving the network's performance in the process, and this will be enforced by contraflow constraints in our model. The objective would be to create these preemptive evacuation routes. We are going to designate them for heterogeneous alternative fuel vehicles, and they will get us to the shelters in a prompt manner, with seamless evacuation routes for every vehicle fuel type, with contraflow traffic control enforced for all vehicle fuel types. And we're going to account for the refueling or charging time in the process, guarantee access to refueling stations so that we can avoid evacuees being stranded, and acknowledging the heterogeneity of the vehicle types. In this process, we put forward the K minimum spanning tree problem for every K alternative fuel vehicle type. And we introduce the hub constraints so that we can capture the need to access refueling and charging infrastructure on the way to safety. Notice here that we assume that the charging or refueling infrastructure network is already set. And of course, the network in this case is independent of the evacuation flow, right? Because these network providers are often motivated by profit maximization initiatives, right? They care about meeting the demand during habitual travel patterns, and they will solve a very different problem to facilitate and locate these chargers or gas stations in the process. So infrastructure is already there. In our second model, we're going to address the need for supplementary infrastructure. Okay. One important consideration as we're modeling the problem is how we capture the charging infrastructure or refueling needs, and the limitations of the driving range of the vehicles. We introduce what is called hub constraints. So we have 1,000 K hubs. Remember, K is the vehicle fuel type. This will be a natural number of links, transportation network links, whose summation of distance will be a proxy for the vehicle's driving range of a specific vehicle fuel type. Now, if the evacuee's demand originates from a number of hubs or more away from the shelter, which is what happens here with the evacuees that originate from node I. Then we need to have evacuees that are passing through the refueling or recharging infrastructure node that we see with identified with the triangle, node M, on their way to safety, node S, the square green shelter location. But if evacuees originate from node J, in this case, because we have tau equal to 2, we can see that with one hop, just going through link JS, we can directly access the shelters. Just because for the same vehicle fuel type, we need to accommodate the upstream evacuation flow to access infrastructure, then the evacuation route that our model will propose is highlighted with the green color over here. The refueling time is captured to be proportional to the number of links and the distance that we have to cover to get to the shelter. So we don't spend more time recharging fully, we just recharge enough so that we can have enough battery state of charge, we refuel enough so that we can have fuel to get us to the shelters, not lose any time in the process. The model looks like this. We have several inputs, the origin destination evacuation demand, the specs of the vehicles, as well as their shares in the network, as well as the number of chargers, their locations, and their power levels. Same thing holds for gasoline stations and the refueling efficiency. We also capture transportation network topology, so we solve this problem at the network level, and we have designated already known shelter exit point locations that usually all the areas that are affected by hurricane events, in this case, would fit very well with the preemptive evacuation setup, would have already identified in their networks. The problem modeling is as follows. We start with minimizing the total system travel time and the refueling charging time, subject to the constraints that we mentioned initially, the fact that we need to have one route to safety. This is called seamlessness, contraflow considerations. Then we have flow conservation needs. We need to account for the rerouting process to accommodate the hop constraints and non-negativity integral constraints as well. And the solution methodology is based on a path-based decomposition, where we go ahead with the branch and price algorithm with a column generation process. Now, note that this is a math heuristic, so it gives us a solution. We can evaluate it in small networks, how far away from the optimal it is, but we cannot evaluate it in large networks like the one that we're going to solve for Florida, just because these problems are not solvable with commercial solvers like Groby. Now, in our outputs, we have evacuation route designation, travel time, and the ability to gather insights for different driving ranges of vehicles, fuel station locations, and the shares of vehicle fuel types that we see in our networks. Okay, so the model looks like this. Our objective function minimizes the total system travel time. We use the Bureau of Public Roads function for accounting for the link performance. And note that this is able to capture congestion. So we have a non-linearity. And we have also the ability to track the total system refueling or charging time. Now, in our constraints, we have flow conservation, tree and subtour elimination constraints so that we can have seamlessness, contraflow constraints so that we can use across all the different vehicle fuel types routes only on one direction, and evacuatory constraints, so making sure that we track how many hops away are evacuees from the shelter and their need to access recharging on their way to safety with the hop or refueling the route constraints. Okay, so this is an arc-based minimum spanning tree problem, mixed integer nonlinear problem, quite difficult to solve. The problem size increases with the network size. So we go about a path-based formulation, and in the process, we need to identify a math heuristic to solve it, ransom price with math heuristic column generation. I give you an overview of the algorithm that I developed. So because the link performance function is dependent on the flow, right? So travel time on the links are dependent on flow so that we can capture congestion. We would have the flow dynamically change the travel time dynamically change on its link during its traffic assignment process. So we start with a restricted main problem where we aim to determine evacuation route plans from a set of feasible solutions, minimizing the travel and refueling time. We account for the traffic assignment constraints, the seamlessness constraints, and contra-flow constraints in the process. Then we fix the flow assignment, and we go about solving the pricing sub-problem, where we introduce level correcting algorithm for this purpose. It's in the paper if you are interested in examining that. In this case, we're finding an improving evacuation path for its evacuation origin and vehicle type with shortest path constraints, home constraints, and repeating precision constraints. We check whether the grindy holds. If yes, we're done. Otherwise, we add the improving evacuation path in our original set of feasible solutions, and we go about solving again the restricting main problem. Okay, so in our numerical experiment, we start from, I would say, a relatively toy network. A lot of our colleagues are utilizing the Sioux Falls in South Dakota network as a benchmark. And we assume that from every node, we're going to have evacuees, all of them heading to the northwest point in our network. So node 2, everybody heads there. And there are refueling stations or recharging stations, if you wish, that have been already defined from prior literature. So if, let's say, our colleagues here, Fang Hen, Dr. Yan-Peng Yin, they have already determined what are the optimal locations for deploying chargers on this network. And we follow the recommendations and say these are based on the habitual travel demand. Now let's see how this network will perform when we design evacuation routes for it. Okay, it depends on what type of vehicle fuel traverses the network, right? In a case where we have all vehicles fueled by gas, we can devise an evacuation plan. And because this is a small network, we don't need any refueling needs to be addressed. So we can have from every node one path to safety. And you can see that we don't need any refueling in the process. We can come up with all the performance characteristics of this evacuation process. But on the right-hand side, we have an evacuation plan when all the vehicles are electric. And because we choose the number of links to be for that electric vehicles can traverse in the network before they need to access a charging station in order to head to safety, we can see that we end up having a 4% increase of the total travel and refueling time on the network, and that the recommendation that we have on the map for the electric vehicle travelers is very different than what we had for the gasoline vehicle travelers, right? And you can see that those that originate from the locations that are highlighted with green, and those are the ones that need to pass through infrastructure on the way to safety so that we can accommodate their needs. Those would be stranded. For example, those that originate from node 19 or 20 in the network, they would be stranded if we haven't devised an evacuation plan like the one that you see on your right-hand side. So we are able to address the needs of the electric vehicle drivers in this setup and be cognizant that this will result in a 4% increase of the performance of the evacuation. At the very same time, we can check what is the impact of the driving range. So as you would expect, having a longer driving range, particularly for these electric vehicle travelers, results in improved performance. And you can see here that in this particular network, having a driving range of a battery electric vehicle that it is approximated with 3 hubs, 3 links on the network, would result in invisibility. So we will not be able, with the current deployment of charging infrastructure on the network, facilitate the needs for evacuation of electric vehicle drivers with a tau less than or equal to 3. Okay, we also are able to track the total refueling time. This improves as we are able to increase the driving range of the vehicles because we don't need to recharge so often in this case. We also aim to detect what is the impact of the charging infrastructure network density on evacuation route. And as you would expect, improved density, more chargers on the network. We test pairs and combinations for those 5 charging locations that you see identified with the yellow node. As we are increasing, densifying the number of chargers, we end up seeing better evacuation performance. What is also evident is that for cases where for example, we have no refueling stations, you can see on the graph on the right, we are not able to facilitate evacuation movements for driving ranges that are less than or equal to 7 hops. Yeah, so we are able to see also these limitations in our networks, and of course this depends a lot on the network topology. On the left-hand side, you can see combinations of 2-station scenario where we pick randomly essentially 2 out of the 5 points to populate charger zone. And you can see that there are certain locations that are not conducive to providing good performance. So even though on average the blue line kind of signifies the performance, there are certain pairs that result in worsening the performance. And the location of the existing stations matters and leads to a unique evacuation performance in this case. And kind of this motivates us to start supplementary refueling and charging infrastructure placement. The ability of having such an elaborate algorithm is to apply larger scale network. So we choose South Florida. Maybe that has to do with the fact that I also graduated from the University of Florida and we know a little bit more about the network prior data. So we have the network from Homestead on the southern end up until Jupiter that goes through Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Boca Raton, and West Palm Beach. And you can see that the locations that provide access to Interstate 95, US routes, and Interstate 75 are picked as the shelter locations, essentially, because they provide access to the rest of the network. We create a super shelter node with a dummy node so that we can send all of this there. Now, the vehicle heterogeneity impacts is able to be observed in such a big network, and I think that was the purpose why we devised this model in the first place. So when we create a universal use of gasoline vehicles, everybody on our network just drives gas cars. We can see that the average evacuation time per vehicle is 53 minutes approximately. And when we have equal shares of gas and electric vehicles on our network, we have the ability to provide design routes that account for the charging needs of the electric vehicle drivers in the process. And we note that the evacuation average time per vehicle increases 84.8% to 97.8 minutes. We are able to see on the graphs, on the maps on your right-hand side, that the evacuation routes maintain seamlessness and contractual characteristics while they provide access for refueling, recharging, particularly to the electric vehicle drivers that are highlighted. Yes. Okay, so summary of the findings, and I would suggest if you are interested in this topic to read our paper as well. We have many more recommendations from the policy perspective that do not necessarily fit within the time constraints of this presentation, so please do that. But here we demonstrate that the specifications and the refueling infrastructure network are important in designating these evacuation routes, and that it is extremely of interest to the public agencies to account for the limitations in driving range so that they can maintain feasibility for these electric vehicle drivers to access shelters. Now, we end up showcasing that this is because if we solve this problem for electric vehicle drivers that have access to a sparser charging infrastructure network, we create unique evacuation routes. And that charging infrastructure location matters, so that the pre-existing deployment can facilitate faster or less fast evacuations in this process, dependent on where the charging infrastructure is located at. Okay, it's important to be able to demonstrate also that because during the transition to maybe better vehicle technologies. We're going to have a lot of vehicle fuel types, power types on our network. We need to be cognizant of their differences and model the process. Okay, the next topic, I'm going to try to make sure that I go through that in a faster manner to leave time for questions. Covers the deployment of charging infrastructure, fueling infrastructure to accommodate evacuations. So supplementary locations of placement of this type of infrastructure will be identified in the process to aid faster evacuations and minimize the cost of installing them. This is an effort that was published in the Transportation Research Record and was partly supported by the Illinois PMC grant part of the scholarship. Again, this is joint work with groups PhD candidate Denisa Urba and our undergraduate research assistant Simon Balisi, who is now in the industry, and he also received some honor from the INFORS for his work on this topic. So the motivation pretty much stemming from the outcomes of our prior research. We need to understand how can we strategically supplement existing infrastructure so that we can aid towards faster evacuation movements. And we mentioned already that charging infrastructure placement, the fuel infrastructure placement is based on habitual demand. It is not profitable to only consider evacuation cases, even though it's of the interest of the providers to examine resilience practices and fortification practices of their infrastructure so it can be withstanding on extreme events. Okay, the goal here is to determine the deployment of the refueling stations, charging stations, supporting the evacuation demand. This is a location routing type of problem, and we're going to update the definition of the constraints that we use in order to accommodate rerouting for refueling or charging with the concept of hub betweenness constraints. Okay, so mentioned previously, two types of problems, location model routing problem. The former deploys the stations, the latter designs the evacuation routes in the process. So for the latter problem, we're gonna leverage the previous research, right? So we're gonna integrate it in this process. We have to introduce the concept of the modified network topology. So here you can either pass through a supplementary refueling node or a refueling node, or you can stop and recharge, and we will extend our network to account for that in this process. We're going to use the concept of the usable evacuation path. This has been priorly identified in the literature. So this would be any evacuation path for a specific vehicle fuel type that enables the evacuees to reach the shelter with or without refueling the process. But constructing this usable evacuation path depends on the location of the refueling or charging infrastructure on the network. So the hub betweenness constraints, really, again, we introduced this concept of tau, the number of links that are summation of distance as a proxy for the driving range bound of a vehicle. But now the refueling rule alters a little bit so that we can be more realistic in accounting for the number of times that vehicles need to stop at refueling or charging stations in the process of evacuating. So here, if an evacuee originates from tau or more hops away from the shelter, they need to go through a station for their vehicle fuel type for refueling within tau hubs before reaching the shelter. This means that they will have to every 3 or more hubs to be able to have access to this infrastructure. So here, usable essential paths are the ones identified with the green color, just meeting this refueling charging group. The location routing model is very similar to what you've seen in the past, but the solution process is different because now we have the structure of location routing problem. The objective, similar objective towards the evacuation performance, but we now have to introduce also the cost of deploying supplementary stations on the network. And we are subject to the deployment budget. So we have an upper bound for that. We have flow conservation, seamlessness, contract flow, the hub betweenness constraints, and recourse function because we introduce a vendor's inspired decomposition problem. and non-negativity in ground constraints as part of that. The location problem, vendors inspired composition, the routing problem, similar to our previous effort, ransom price with volume generation procedure. In our paper in Transportation Research Record, we go through these concepts and provide the algorithms in more detail, but I'm happy to elaborate later. Our output is a map with supplementary station locations where we identify those, the travel time and sensitivity with respect to the shares of different vehicle fuel types. You can see the results here for networks where we have universal use of vehicles that have short driving ranges, either 4 hubs or 6 hubs are proxies for the driving range. And when we have shorter driving range, so 4 hubs, we need more supplementary stations. We're able to identify the location, 7 more stations in the South Florida network. The average evacuation time is 255.8 minutes per vehicle. That is because now we account for the multiple stops that vehicles might need to make so that they can reach shelters. The average evacuation time can be a bit reduced in a case where we have vehicles with larger ranges, along with fewer supplementary stations. In the case of 6 hubs of the driving range characterizing the vehicles that utilize the network, we have 4 supplementary stations deployed. I think what is the most interesting part of this analysis is showcasing the results for the vehicle heterogeneity. So here we see a case where we have dominance of gasoline vehicles on the network. You can see that the routes identifying under vehicle type 1, 70% of the vehicles are gasoline, and we have 15% of short-range electric vehicles and 15% large-range electric vehicles. For example, demonstrating the difference between orders of Nissan Leafs and Tesla vehicles, right? In that case, we can identify for the whole network, we need 13 additional supplementary stations, and that the evacuation time is 1:42:19. That is driven primarily by the dominance of gasoline vehicles on the network that do not necessarily need to stop to refuel frequently. Only the electric vehicles, 30% of those need to do that. But when we increase the dominance of those short-range electric vehicles in particular, in this case, we have 55% of low-range vehicles in the system, we end up seeing that we actually need fewer supplementary stations in the process. And that is because we can design evacuation routes that are conducive to their rerouting needs to access infrastructure in the process. As expected, the evacuation time average per vehicle increases about 80%, and planners of these evacuation routes need to be cognizant of this increase so that they can facilitate and start evacuation orders sooner. I highlight again the summary of findings as before. I don't want to repeat myself, so I want to emphasize a bit of newer efforts in this process. We are conducting a vulnerability assessment of the electric vehicle network during evacuations, because we noticed that one metric is not enough to give us a complete comprehensive picture of the barriers that our vehicles face when they are evacuating the network. And we also need to capture effects of disruptions on the network, disconnections, or non-operational charging stations in the process. So we go ahead with a vulnerability assessment that tracks changes in travel time, charging time, queuing time, the number of evacuees that require charging in the process of evacuating, any stranded evacuees, and the change in chargers accessibility in the process. We implement that in South Lake, Michigan, in the region of Chicago, utilizing information from hydrologists, where they point out where mild flooding or severe flooding risks are going to occur in our network that can lead to unreliable charging infrastructure operations and flooding to transportation network links. And we are able to construct and provide more information on how these flooding events are going to impact electric vehicle evacuations process. Research that my graduate student is working currently right now is on the behavioral implications for shorter notice evacuations in networks like Chicago, where we need to know more about how do people actually pick routes in the process of evacuating so that we can more accurately model their decision making, and how do they choose the charging infrastructure to stop and recharge their vehicles. Of course, there's a lot of other behavioral questions in this space. We do not currently address every one of those, but I believe that there's a lot of interest in this space from the academic community right now. So I'm excited to see the results from them as well. Oh yeah, and what I want to point out is that the electric vehicles are not only sometimes a barrier during the evacuation process, but also a solution during power outage events, because when we are settling in place, the batteries of electric vehicles can be used as backup generators to provide and meet needs that we have in our residences. So there is an opportunity through this bi-directional energy exchange to have our vehicles become portable battery storage devices. That's pretty much it. Sorry if you have any questions, and I'm happy to provide answers if I have them.
Thank you, Ria, for a nice presentation. I have two more general questions. So one is, about 25 years ago in Houston, they evacuated for a hurricane, and then a lot of people died on the road. Since then, Harris County do not evacuate anyone. They just tell everyone to stay at home. And if you get flooded, we'll come and get you. So for that kind of decision, how do you think your research would impact that kind of policy, essentially decision making? And then more along the same question, when you're running your solution like that, do you consider the congestion at the network level in terms of how long does it take to reach? Because I drive a Tesla, on a highway, I barely get 140 miles out of it, because you don't want to go all the way to 5% before you reach the charging station. So you want to start looking for a charge around 30%, right? So, and that's where you charge. So I'm just wondering, would that like congestion is factored in your analysis?
Great set of questions. So let's start with the first one. Regarding the policy making towards evacuating or not, I think this depends on how much information you have in ahead. Generally, I'm not exactly sure what are the recommendations in the Harris County, but overall, looking at different locations in the Gulf region and South Florida, and also thinking about other cases like wildfire evacuations and stuff like that. I think that it depends on how much information you have in advance, how fast you can provide this information. And I think that this set of modeling tools can help public agencies have more accurate information in order to be able to decide whether they will suggest evacuating or sheltering in place. But the reality is that the model that we propose can capture heterogeneity even of the battery state of charge of the vehicles, because theoretically, there can be, even if you have, let's say, a vehicle with a 300-mile of range, you might have not charged it for 3 days, right? So, or you might be outside of home when an evacuation order is put forward. So, our model can account for these issues. Of course, we would need a much more elaborate evacuation origin destination metrics in the process, but it's possible that you can get all this information in. So yeah, I think that from the perspective of deciding to evacuate or not, yeah, this set of information, these models and the designated routes can provide additional insight to decision makers on what exactly to suggest. On the other hand, regarding the ability to, if I understand correctly, your point is whether we can track the impact of the conditions on the road on the battery of our vehicle.
picking specific charging stations along the evacuation routes, you're essentially guiding all the electric vehicles to reach them. So you're kind of like compromising the sort of compromising, not the right word, but you're impacting the equilibrium during the evacuation in some sense.
Yeah,
Right.
there's no equilibrium usually in
But I'm saying
evacuation
is that you're
setups.
essentially increasing the flow at a specific corridors.
Yes. This is the set of information that is available to the drivers in advance so that they can make decisions. What we do, and here I'm not sure whether I highlighted or not, is kind of a planning exercise so that this information can be provided in advance to the driver so that they can know that for sure, if they follow this route to shelter, they're going to have access to recharging or refueling infrastructure on the way to safety. Now, from an operational standpoint, the evacuation modeling would be quite different, right? So there are other techniques that can be used for that setup, I would say. So if we are to track, and we do that in our vulnerability assessment, we track many more metrics in the process. But I would say that there is particular use of our problem here. If you were to focus on other aspects of the evacuation, you would have to tailor the model accordingly.
We have 2 more minutes, so we can have like one short question with a short answer.
Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. I really like it. I just have a quick question. I don't have a benchmark for how long time do we have to evacuate? So when you say like 90 minutes or you say like 250 minutes, is that really enough, or like, is it like too long? I'm not sure, because I was thinking like, you mentioned that your model is nonlinear and can capture congestion. So I was wondering why, when you have a diverse fuel scenario, your time always goes up, because my understanding is, well, people will be charging, maybe that will be helping with the congestion, and so why isn't it like balancing out or something like that?
So good question here. So when you don't have the need to refuel, you can just follow the shortest path to a shelter, right? But when you have the need to refuel, dependent on the location of recharging or refueling infrastructure on the network, you will have to reroute and also spend time on the refueling station, recharging location, which is going to, because of the numbers, the particular numbers that we have. If the recharging processes are very similar to refueling processes, so approximately 4-6 minutes, then we can see a lot of benefits in our outcomes. But because recharging often can exceed 20 minutes, dependent on the vehicle state of charge or how much they need to recharge in order to get to their location, to their destination, the shelter, that plays a role in this effort. So we are able to track these. And actually our comparison between universal gasoline vehicles versus a diversity of vehicle fuel types aims to serve as an understanding of how much time and how many resources the agencies need to invest so that they can make sure that their evacuation orders earlier, and they are prepared to have the coordination and enforcement efforts out there for longer, potentially exposed to weather phenomena that be inclement.
So if 90 minutes is a good evacuation time, or?
No, I don't. I think it depends on the network and how far you go and where is the harm. And I don't have a recommendation for what an evacuation kind of time would be good enough. There's a lot of other implications there. Here in the networks, we kind of go about, particularly in the small network, we go about saying that, oh, the northwest node is going to be a shelter, but in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, there's not any reason for that being there because it's not an area affected by hurricanes or anything like that. But in the South Florida, we can be more confident about where the shelters are. We can be more confident about the actual timings that we compute. So hopefully this provides some information on what would be of interest to agencies. If you can very quickly do that.
I'll do my best. First of all, thank you. I was just thinking about this from the perspective of the person who lives in flooding, hurricane, I don't know, tornado prone region. That I think one of the biggest problems with EVs is on top of not having enough charging stations at any given time at any given station, you know, I pull up and it's broken, right? So I think that's gonna be exponentially magnified in such events. So on top of that, you have to like wait 20 minutes and I don't know, maybe your car is more generally EVs are more fragile in such conditions. So how do you speak to the consumer? Because in the end, they're gonna pay the money to buy the EV, right? Like, how do you give them confidence to actually buy an EV, given that they live in particularly these areas?
It's a great question, and I think that there have been talks about the importance of having electric vehicle drivers prepared for these instances. In terms of the reliability of charging infrastructure, that is an issue with respect of the network providers right now. I think that there are certain networks that do a good job in maintaining their infrastructure and others not so much. And probably this needs to be addressed and will be addressed from the market side, right? Consumers will not choose them anymore and they will have to be more reliable to draw in greater market share. But from the electric vehicle driver standpoint, I think that first of all, these evacuation events or extreme events happen rarely, right? So maybe those that live in Florida would have to consider such a case once every few years, depending also on the path of the hurricane. But I don't think that this decision would need to be the determinant of choosing an electric vehicle or not, given that usually in these locations that are often affected by these events, there are other means to evacuate or other instructions for sheltering in resilience community hubs. So there are other efforts to maintain, to keep them away from harm in the process. So I guess the selection of ownership, I don't think that it depends too much in the ability to be responsive to these events. But I might be wrong because I think there's still a lot of room towards understanding what would be the decision making for ownership in such states.
I think we are out of time. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you.